He is no longer directly communicating with the Guthrie family and says those conversations, music, are being handled by the FBI. Which is interesting because remember, initially in charge of the investigation still as the sheriff of Pima County. Remember, it was never handed over to the FBI. Music. I know we have DNA that is unknown who the contributor or depositor is, but music think they're getting closer to finding out who that was. When the labs tell us, hey, there's nothing else we can music do, well then maybe we've got a problem. We've got a cold case. But right now the labs aren't telling us that. In my experience, and Brian, this is going on over 40 years, it's unusual for the originating agency, the investigative agency who has originating authority, which the sheriff does, not to be in communication with the victim's family. It was either a burglary gone wrong or it was never a burglary, right? A burglary is about theft and removal. Kidnapping is about control. So the longer this goes on, the fact that you got a $1.2 million reward that has not moved the needle whatsoever. He was not concerned about being found. We have the other photo. The whole purpose of removing the ring camera was he disguised himself. What he could not disguise was a vehicle. So you remove the camera because you don't want it transmitting a picture of the vehicle, because we know that the blood stopped at the exact place a vehicle would have had to have been. The sheriff is no longer talking to the family. 104 days after Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in the Catalina foothills, the man who is technically in charge of the investigation, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, has acknowledged in a new interview with People magazine that he is no longer directly communicating with the Guthrie family. Those conversations are now being handled exclusively by the FBI. The sheriff, who held on to the case when federal agents offered to take the lead, he sent DNA to a private lab in Florida instead of Quantico, who was kept out of the crime scene for the first 4 days by his own admission, or excluded the FBI for the first 4 days, depending on whose account you believe. That sheriff is no longer the point of contact for the family of the missing woman whose case defines his tenure. He also said something else. The public is frustrated, even the Guthrie family. That is the first time the sheriff has publicly acknowledged that the family whose mother was abducted from her home in the middle of the night is frustrated with the investigation. And he used another word that has never appeared in his public statements before. Cold case. When the labs tell us there is nothing else they can do, then maybe we have a problem. We have a cold case. But right now, the labs are not telling us that. The DNA is still being processed. The rootless hair sample is still being analyzed. And the sheriff says he believes they are getting closer to identifying who deposited it. But the acknowledgement that a cold case is even a possibility 104 days into an investigation that began with presidential attention, FBI deployment, and wall-to-wall national media coverage is a shift in tone that should not be overlooked. It would be hard to figure out, well, why. There's enough out there on the record, as they say. There's enough in the interviews. You can see stuff to where it's kind of like this may be in an advanced stage. Maybe there's something going on we don't know about, which clearly falls within the FBI swim lane. This is what we do. We do this really well. I have no idea what it is, but let's say it's an advanced hostage negotiation or an advanced negotiation. That's clearly something. But to not have any contact is something that I think that's a question that ought to be answered. The question is, you say you don't have contact. Question is why? Why? That is the question a former law enforcement investigator with over 40 years of experience says must be answered. In his assessment, it is unusual for the originating agency, the agency with primary investigative authority, to have no direct communication with the victim's family. The sheriff's office opened the case. The sheriff's office is technically still in charge, and yet the sheriff himself is saying the FBI is now handling all family communications. The investigator offered two possible explanations. Either the case has entered an advanced stage, something like a hostage negotiation, or a sophisticated investigative phase that falls squarely within the FBI's expertise, music and swim lane. Or the family has lost confidence in the sheriff and has chosen to communicate exclusively through the federal agency they trust more. The investigator emphasized something fundamental about working with victims' families. You always want to maintain contact. You always want to be the person, music, who breaks news to them. You never want them finding out from another source. And at some point, you are going to need their help building the case, testifying, providing evidence. Cutting off communication with the family is not just unusual, it is a departure from one of the first rules of criminal investigation. The sheriff also used a phrase that the investigator immediately identified as contradictory. On one hand, Nanos said his team would solve this case 100%. On the other hand, he acknowledged that if the labs come back with nothing, they have a cold case. It cannot be both. Either the case will be solved with certainty, or there is a real possibility that the evidence will not produce a result. The investigator noted that the sheriff's language about the DNA, that they are getting closer, likely indicates the analysis has moved beyond basic identification and into investigative genetic genealogy. The painstaking process of building family trees from partial DNA profiles that can take 60 to 90 days or longer. And if you want to follow how the DNA results, the sheriff's communication cut off, and the investigation's trajectory develop, make sure you're subscribed. Because in this case, every update has changed what we thought we knew. Because we know that the blood stopped at the exact place a vehicle would have had to have been for Nancy to be put into a car. The question that was there one or was there two? So, when I look at this and just this is based on my training and experience, you would be hard-pressed to find cases of where somebody that went in to do a burglary decided that kidnapping was the least risky alternative to getting out of the house. Because then you have to plan for it. You have to plan for control and exfiltration. As time goes on, said you gotta quit treating this as a missing person. It's not. It's a no-body homicide. Her age, her cardiac condition, the time of night she was taken out, the blood. This is a no-body homicide. A no-body homicide. That is the assessment of a former investigator who traveled to Tucson in the days after Nancy disappeared, spent 4 days on the ground, and concluded that the evidence points overwhelmingly toward an abduction, not a burglary gone wrong. His reasoning is methodical. A burglary is about theft and removal. You go in, you take things, you leave. If something goes wrong, if you encounter a homeowner, the instinct of a burglar is to flee, not to kidnap. Kidnapping requires a completely different skill set, a different mindset, and a level of planning that does not emerge spontaneously in the middle of a failed theft. You have to plan for control. You have to plan for exfiltration. You have to have a vehicle positioned. You have to know how to subdue a victim. You have to have thought through every step before you walk through that door. The investigator's analysis of the doorbell camera footage produced a conclusion that reframes the entire crime. The masked figure was not concerned about being identified personally. He stood on the porch long enough to be captured. He did not rush. He did not panic. He exhibited what the investigator described as sophisticated tradecraft, the kind of operational discipline that indicates this was not his first time conducting this type of operation. What he could not disguise was a vehicle, and that is why the camera was removed. Not to prevent his face from being captured because his face was already covered by a ski mask, but to prevent the camera from transmitting an image of the vehicle that was positioned at the curb where the blood trail stopped. The blood evidence tells a specific story. It started inside or near the front entrance of Nancy's home and continued to a point at the curb, the exact location where a vehicle would have been parked to receive a person being transported from the house. The blood stopped at the curb. It did not continue into the street. It did not trail down the sidewalk. It stopped at the point of vehicle loading. And the camera was disabled before Nancy was brought outside, ensuring that whatever vehicle was parked there would never appear in any footage transmitted to the cloud. The investigator addressed the question of digital evidence that the sheriff discussed in his People magazine interview. The sheriff described an enormous catalog of surveillance footage from intersections, neighborhoods, businesses, and home security systems. Thousands and thousands of videos. The approach the sheriff described as cataloging vehicles by type. All the white trucks in one file, all the red sedans in another, and waiting until a suspect is identified to cross-reference their vehicle against the catalog. The investigator disagreed with this approach. He described it as inverted. His methodology, developed through decades of experience including post-9/11 work with the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, would reverse the process entirely. Instead of cataloging every vehicle and waiting for a suspect, he would identify the time window between approximately 2:12 and 2:28 a.m., when the pacemaker data indicates Nancy was being moved, and then pull every vehicle that passed through the egress routes from Nancy's neighborhood during that window. That produces a much smaller subset of vehicles of interest. Then you work backwards from those vehicles rather than forwards from a suspect you do not yet have. The investigator compared the sheriff's approach to looking for a needle in a haystack by making the haystack smaller. His approach: use a bigger magnet. That lends more credibility to a single person, single offender, rather than two offenders. Anytime you have two people cannot keep a secret. A secret can only be kept by one person, no matter what they say. One person. The $1.2 million reward has not moved the needle. Nobody has come forward. Nobody has made the call. And the investigator believes this fact more than any forensic evidence, more than any digital analysis, points toward a single offender operating alone. Two people cannot keep a secret. In criminal organizations, in gangs, in partnerships, the pressure of a major reward and intense public scrutiny eventually breaks someone. They talk, they brag, they confide in a friend or a relative who then makes the call. But when a single person commits a crime alone, there is no second person to break under pressure. The secret stays with the person who committed the act. The investigator also addressed the possibility that the suspect is not from the Tucson area. If the person who took Nancy traveled in from another city, another state, or another country, the chances of local law enforcement having prior contact with them, arrest records, field interview cards, intelligence reports, drops to nearly zero. There would be nothing organic in the police files. No usual suspect to pull from a database. And the doorbell footage, while dramatic, does not provide enough context for facial recognition, gait analysis, or the kind of identification that requires extended video. A few seconds of a masked figure on an infrared camera is not enough for someone watching from another city to say, "I recognize that person." The investigator raised the possibility that the camera was removed specifically to hide the vehicle, because in his experience, vehicles are far easier to identify than masked individuals. A piece of a grill can identify a year, make, and model. AI can match vehicle outlines from security footage. A license plate captured on a traffic camera can be traced in minutes. The masked figure knew this, and he ensured that the one piece of evidence that could identify him, his transportation, would never be captured on the camera that was recording his approach to the front door. The digital forensics remain the most labor-intensive aspect of the investigation. Thousands of videos from traffic cameras, Ring doorbells, business security systems, and intersection monitors across a radius that extends from the Catalina foothills neighborhood in every direction. The sheriff's office and the FBI are processing this footage, cataloging vehicles, building a database that will be cross-referenced against whatever suspect eventually emerges from the DNA analysis, the genetic genealogy, or a tip that breaks the case open. The DNA at Quantico remains the case's best hope. The rootless hair sample is being analyzed through investigative genetic genealogy, the same methodology that identified the Golden State Killer, Brian Kohberger, and dozens of other suspects in cases that had gone cold for years or decades. The process takes time. It requires building family trees from partial genetic profiles, identifying biological relatives in public genealogy databases, and narrowing the results until a single individual emerges. The sheriff says the labs are getting closer. The investigator says the timeline is consistent with a 60 to 90-day IgG process that may be nearing completion. But the investigator also issued a caution about the hair itself. DNA does not come with a date and timestamp. A hair found at a crime scene could have been deposited at any time, days, weeks, or months before the crime occurred. The crime scene was uncontrolled for a period of time before it was properly secured. Could the hair have been introduced during that window? Could it be a red herring? A piece of biological material that has nothing to do with the person who took Nancy? Locard's exchange principle states that every contact leaves a trace. Touch DNA can be transferred from person to surface without direct contact with the crime scene. If the hair came from the outside of the suspect's clothing, the ski mask for example, it could belong to anyone the suspect encountered before arriving at Nancy's home. The investigation has entered its fourth month. The sheriff acknowledges the family is frustrated. The DNA is still being processed. The vehicle that carried Nancy away from her home has not been identified, and the man who is technically in charge of the investigation is no longer speaking to the family of the woman he has promised to find. The FBI has taken over family communications. The reward sits at $1.2 million unclaimed. And the investigator who assessed this case from the beginning has called it what he believes it is: a no-body homicide committed by a single sophisticated operator who planned the abduction, brought the tools, disabled the camera to hide his vehicle, and carried an 84-year-old woman from her home into the night while her pacemaker recorded every heartbeat of terror. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. If you have any information, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit tips at tips.fbi.gov. The reward currently exceeds $1.2 million. This story is far from over. Subscribe now because in this case, every update has changed what we thought we knew. This content is analytical based on publicly available sources for informational and awareness purposes only. It does not represent official conclusions. All individuals mentioned are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Viewers should consult additional independent sources for a complete perspective.